And you've just heard First Time by Chiara Berardelli, taken from the album Archaeology, which is coming very soon. In fact, it's coming out in July, I believe. And I'm delighted to be joined by Chiara now. Hello there.
Hi, Alistair. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. And before we talk about the album as a whole, what can you tell us about that track, First Time?
So, without giving too much away, it's about rekindling a relationship that you had when you were young with somebody that happens to now live on the other side of the world. But it's about when things get complicated because that person lives on the other side of the world. You kind of think back to just that feeling of just, especially when you were young, when those complications weren't there, and just how you felt about them before the practical, how do I actually make this work stuff sort of kicks in. So
it's interesting you say, without giving too much away, is that the thing you feel about songs, is that people should interpret them how they will, rather than be explicit kind of stories?
Well, yeah, I'm laughing because I said without giving too much away, and then I just said it all. So that's not really. I mean, definitely, I have, I have like reasons that I write a song, but I don't really want to kind of spell it all out. And partly because I think it doesn't quite often. I mean, I want things to sound quite poetic, and sometimes a bit of that works, but I don't want to just like tell this sort of incremental story. I don't think that's very exciting, but also because I definitely would like people to just take what they want from it, and sometimes people take really different things from it. I mean, that's obviously if they're actually listening to the words, which not everybody does, but I think you'll get the sentiment of the song across however you do it, really.
And the album itself, how did it come about? What was what sparked the beginning of this album?
Well, I'm always kind of writing songs, and usually at some point I just think, right, okay, do I have enough for an album? And mostly my songs are about my life. I like to try sometimes to write songs about other people, but it doesn't happen very often unless I'm given a brief or a specific like collaboration or something. So quite a lot of these songs are about a long distance relationship. And I'd probably written some of them already before we went into the pandemic. And then just the way that things were, I started working on them with a friend of mine, Biff Smith, who's a musician and songwriter. And because he had time, because he wasn't, doing his normal stuff. And I felt like it really, I think because he's got a lot more playing experience, what he brought to the songs was quite different, I think, to what I did. So I think I think what we each are best at really complemented each other, and that was just really, really good. And also, I think the fact that he was coming round and we were working on the songs quite often outside in the snow meant that I was quite motivated to. Sometimes I find on my own that can be a bit of an issue. And then he was very encouraging to sort of, I'm always quite, once I've got the songs ready, I sort of just want to go straight into the studio. And he was very, no, I think you should, really work on the demos first. So I did, more so than I think I ever have. And as a consequence of that, I did a lot of vocal harmonies, which is something I've never really explored before.
Right.
And I really enjoyed doing that. And then when I went into the studio, Johnny that I worked with in the studio was saying, well, that, these harmonies are an integral part of the songs, and I think that was partly because I had more time. And also by that point, I was having symptoms of long COVID, which meant that I didn't always have the energy to do stuff. So the whole process of it took a lot longer than normal.
Right.
Which in some ways I think was really good because it made me really kind of think, no, is this how, what I want the song to sound like? And it allowed us to go back over things, which I think if I'd been okay and we were just sort of getting it done, I would have been on more of a kind of roll, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. So it kind of made you change from the normal process of write a song, record the song, put it out. play it live or whatever, and then repeat, that kind of thing?
Well, yeah, I mean, normally I would always do an album's worth. I wouldn't do it kind of song by song. But yeah, when I have gone into the studio to do it, it's been a kind of, I mean, it's always ended up taking longer, but the initial recording, it's like try and get as much done as you can in a chunk. And this was different because I kept not being okay, basically. I couldn't, so I'd have to cancel sessions, and so it just took a lot. It just spread it over time. And the thing about that is that, you know, you might have an idea that you're going to do something one day, and if you did that same thing 2 months later, it would actually be quite different. So the longer you sort of spread things out over, I mean, it's good in some ways because it gives you time to fine tune it, but also you also have to come to a point where you just go, that's it, you know, that got to stop there, you know.
And is collaborating with someone like Biff, is that the kind of advice that you end up, advice is maybe the wrong thing, but you can discuss these things that maybe previously you would tackle on your own and say, well, this is how I'm going to do it here.
Yeah, I think with Biff, it was more about the writing that we did together, really. It was more a kind of writing thing. When it came to recording, it was more working with Johnny in the studio. I think that was how that worked, really.
And are there other people involved in the album? Or is it just really yourself?
Musicians, yeah. I have drums and bass. So I have Richard Anderson and Ross Wilson, who play in many different bands. Strange Blue Dreams, they're in Strange Blue Dreams, and yeah, and lots of other bands. So they're playing, which is great. And then Johnny plays on 2 or 3 songs, actually, electric guitar. And then I had Jackie Baxter, who used to play cello with me, who ended up moving up north, and she plays cello on, I think, just a couple of songs, and violin. And then Ailey Reid, who works or used to work in the cafe at Film City, where Johnny has his kind of workspace, she plays the flute. So she ended up playing on, I think, just 1 song, possibly 2. Yeah, so that's it, really.
That kind of answers one of the things I was thinking about, is that it does seem to me that there's a real kind of sense of community among people making music in Scotland. Would you say that's right? You know, you've mentioned musicians that either play in other bands or produce other people and all of those things. And it does seem to me, kind of as a listener purely, that there's a lot of connections in music being made in Scotland, and they do seem to be supportive ones.
Yeah, definitely. I think if you're a solo person like me, you need, you know, unless you're going to do obviously a completely solo album, but you need other musicians, you know, so you're never doing it on your own. And I suppose then it just sort of depends who you meet along the way. I mean, often the 2 different producers I've worked with, because they work with so many musicians that come in and out of their studio, they know people, and that's often that's generally how I've met other musicians, and other ways as well. But that's definitely one of them, you know.
And going back to the album, are there themes running through the songs that you can recognize and kind of pick out?
Well, yeah, I mean, the long distance relationship is probably quite a predominant theme. I also have it's funny, I realized that I have some, I mean, I just have recurring themes, and one of them is about believing in yourself and sort of encouraging yourself and not giving up on your dreams. There's always a couple of those ones in my albums for sure, depending on what stage of that I'm at. And there's the album, I kind of was, it took me, funnily enough, I've just, with my other albums, I've always named them from a track, mostly because I'm always a bit stumped as to what to call the album. But this time again, probably because I had more time, I decided to call it Archaeology, and there isn't a track called Archaeology, although I did actually start writing one yesterday, which I might sort of do separately. And anyway, the theme of Archaeology, the sort of overarching theme of the album, is I left my job as a doctor now about 6 or 7 years ago.
Right.
And since that time, I mean, before that, I was kind of doing a bit of music and doctoring, but I gave it up permanently 6 years ago. And since that time, it's sort of, I suppose it's this idea of discovering. I feel I've become, because I always wanted to do this. I didn't really want to be a doctor. So I feel I'm sort of becoming myself.
Yeah.
And archaeology is this idea of kind of buried parts of yourself, buried in the past or buried inside you, rediscovering them. So that's the kind of general idea. And there's a song, the next song that I'm releasing actually in the middle of June is called Can I Be Me, which is sort of that idea, you know.
So I mean, it seems to me that idea of kind of returning to not a place you were, you know, or that idea before, but or even a time, but a person that you were before, perhaps.
A person,
When you
yeah.
had these kind of things, wanting to be the singer-songwriter, having a kind of less, perhaps complicated life, is that in there, is it?
Yeah, I think the person that I was, but I suppose also the person I might have been, because if you do something else for a long time and when most of the time when I was being a doctor, I wasn't playing music. I
Right.
kind of, I didn't really want to keep it as a hobby. I made this quite, I remember thinking to myself, you know, if I'm not going to do music as my career, I don't want to do it. That'll just make me sad. I mean, looking back, that was, anyway, it doesn't matter. It probably wasn't a very wise thing to think, but that's what I did. So for a long time, I wasn't being a musician. And so I do feel that I totally buried it
Right.
until later, and various things happened that allowed it to come out again, I suppose. And so it's very much a kind of releasing of those things. And I guess once I've left my job, and I'm not having to kind of go back into that way of thinking anymore, then bit by bit I can become more of this person that I think I should have been, if you see what I mean.
And when you kind of decided you were going to stop making music, were you also stopping really listening to music, or, you know, did you kind of make that kind of break?
I definitely, no, I wouldn't say I stopped listening to it. I wouldn't say I stopped listening to it. What I did was I would still sometimes play the piano at parties and things like that, but I couldn't write music anymore. I couldn't, I mean, not that I'd particularly written songs when I was younger, but I was sort of on the way to, if you know what I mean. And the kind of the sort of creative sitting at the piano and coming up with something new just didn't happen every time I sat down to play, because I couldn't really play anymore. And because I'd also squashed the idea, I think. So I just used to get annoyed with myself and then not play for another however long, you know.
And I mean, I'm right in saying you made your debut album in kind of 2010, roughly about
Yeah.
that time. So what was that like to do after a period of, as you say, maybe burying all this, these years that you had? Was this like a kind of, you know, explosion?
Yeah, exactly. What happened was I left my job for the first time in my late 30s, and I went to study music in London. I did a 2-year kind of HND. And then I came back up and sort of was kind of lost for a little while. And then I found out that you could do a master's in songwriting in Bath. I went to this songwriting festival in Bath and I found out you could do this years-long master's, and I did it.
Yeah.
And the end of that part of the course was making an album from the songs that you'd written on the course. So that's where that album. So in a way, it was kind of like I felt like I couldn't really do it on my own. I needed the structure of something to get me doing it. And like in the first term of the songwriting course, the chap who ran the course, we had to write a song a week.
Yeah.
Which I actually found really difficult because I'd only ever written songs sort of when they came to me. You know, this was sort of sitting down to, but it kind of got everything moving. And I always think that I needed the instruction, go and write a song.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I wonder if, coming from the academic background of studying medicine, you almost needed that academic structure and approval, if you like, passing the HND to then go and say, yeah, I can do this now?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a bit of that. I think it's also, I felt quite guilty leaving my job, and that took me a long time to kind of let that go. And in a way, as you say, if you go and do, I couldn't just sort of sit at home and write songs. I needed the structure. And also I did learn a lot from the course, a lot in confidence, which I really needed as well. And also I didn't really think I could sing until I did that course. And it was only the fact that we would perform every week. We had to perform the song, or we didn't have to. We could get someone else to sing it, but most people sang their own song in a small group, maybe 12 of us. And it was the safety of doing it in such a small space. And people were sort of saying, oh, you've got a nice voice. And I was thinking, what? Don't be mad, And then I just kind of got the confidence of like, oh, I like singing my songs, this is, because up until that point, I'd kind of always imagined other people would sing them because I couldn't sing, So it's funny the ideas that we have,
It's really interesting because I've spoken to quite a few writers over the years who similarly felt they had to go through a master's in creative writing or something like that, almost to get the self-belief that they could then go on and write, which is interesting because I think it's a fairly modern thing that, you maybe wouldn't get.
Oh, yeah.
Course or a creative.
Well, when I did that course in Bath, which was in probably about 15 years ago, you couldn't do that anywhere else in the UK. Now you can do it up here, but you couldn't do it anywhere else. It's really new. I think it's also, for me, I definitely think there's a bit of that, the confidence of it. But for me, it was all about permission.
Yeah.
It was all about the space away from my job and concentrating just on that and the permission to do it, like a grown-up telling me to. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but I know that that's how it was.
Yeah, I can totally understand that. Absolutely. So are you going to be playing the songs from the album live? Do you have any plans for gigs?
Yeah, I had a couple of gigs. I had a gig at the end of last year at the Poetry Club, and that was the first gig of sort of mine for quite a while. Things have been difficult just because I haven't been well, and I couldn't really have organised one before that. Just it takes energy, obviously, and I was always a bit worried about cancelling it and that kind of thing. So I was getting better. So I had one in November in the Poetry Club, and then I did one in Leith Depot in February. And then I've had a few spells of not being so good this year. So I feel a bit like I was going to organise a sort of autumn tour, and I'm just sort of holding off, I think, until I see that I'm a bit better, and I feel I just have a longer stretch of being okay, which I usually get in the summer. Hopefully, but yeah, I'd love to do. I mean, I actually would like to go on a village hall tour of Scotland. That's what I was talking to you about before. I like small gigs. I like community small gigs. That that's the sort of thing I like, really.
Oh, absolutely. It's a great idea because there's some fantastic places and places often that don't get enough people traveling to them.
Exactly.
Music, yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
And just remind us, Chiara, before we go, when's the album coming out?
So fingers crossed. I think it's the 26th of July. It's the end of July. End of July, yeah.
Well, Chiara, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
And this is Chiara Berardelli and Little More.